When the feared Kryllian Empire intercepts a lone human transport vessel carrying refugees, Warlord Thrax sees easy prey. His forces brutally attack the defenseless ship, killing most aboard, including targeting a human child for sport. What the arrogant aliens don't realize is that the child's father, Marcus Webb, is a retired human military operative with a very particular set of skills. In exactly 10 minutes of calculated fury, Marcus transforms from grieving parent to unstoppable force of vengeance, systematically dismantling the Kryllian command structure with nothing but salvaged weapons and pure human determination. The galaxy's most feared warriors learn too late why humans are nicknamed the Quiet Ones, because when they finally make noise, civilizations tremble. In the outer rim of the Andorian sector, where space dust mingles with the dreams of the desperate, the Kryllian Empire had earned a reputation that made grown Xentorians wet themselves and caused Vexari diplomats to suddenly develop urgent business elsewhere. For 3 centuries, these 7-foot-tall, chahydonous nightmares had carved their way through the galaxy like a plasma cutter through butter, leaving behind a trail of conquered worlds and species that now existed only in historical footnotes. Warlord Thrax, supreme commander of the 4th Devastation Fleet, stood on the bridge of his flagship Bone Crusher, with all the casual confidence of a creature who had never met anything he couldn't kill, eat, or enslave, preferably in that order. His mandibles clicked with satisfaction as he surveyed the tactical display, where a single blip appeared like a lost lamb wandering into a den of particularly hungry wolves. "Sir," chittered Subcommander Vask, his voice carrying that peculiar mix of fear and excitement that comes from serving under someone who considers genocide a recreational activity. "We have detected an unescorted vessel. Designation—" He paused, consulting his scanner with the kind of confusion typically reserved for beings encountering their first mathematical equation. "Safe harbor, human registry." Thrax's compound eyes gleamed with predatory delight. Humans, the galaxy's newest additions to the interstellar community, a species so laughably weak that they required artificial atmospheres to survive in space and actually died if you removed certain vital organs. The Kryllian Empire had been meaning to pay them a visit, but other, more challenging conquests had taken priority. Now, it seemed, the prey had delivered itself. "Humans," Thrax mused, his voice carrying the same tone one might use when discussing particularly tender livestock. "I hear they taste like, what was the word, chicken?" The bridge crew erupted in the kind of laughter that would make hyenas file a complaint for copyright infringement. These were beings who found entertainment in watching worlds burn and considered torture a form of performance art. To them, humans represented the kind of easy victory that would barely qualify as a warm-up exercise. "Shall we hail them, sir?" Vask asked, already knowing the answer, but maintaining the pretense that Kryllian military protocol involved something other than kill everything that moves. "Oh, by all means," Thrax replied, settling into his command throne with the satisfied grunt of a predator who had just spotted a particularly plump gazelle. "Let's see what these soft, pink creatures have to say for themselves." The main screen flickered to life, revealing the interior of what could generously be described as a flying tin can held together by prayers and the kind of optimism that only comes from having absolutely no other options. Captain Sarah Chen, a woman whose face bore the weathered look of someone who had seen too much and slept too little, appeared on screen. Behind her, Thrax could make out the faces of what were clearly refugees, families, children, the elderly, all wearing expressions of hope, mixed with the kind of bone-deep exhaustion that comes from running from something terrible. "This is Captain Chen of the Refugee Transport Safe Harbor," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor Thrax's keen predatory senses could detect beneath the surface. "We're carrying civilian evacuees from the Tau Ceti colonies. We're not armed and pose no threat to your vessels." Thrax's laughter was the kind of sound that would make a banshee consider early retirement. "Threat? Oh, my dear little meat sack, you misunderstand the situation entirely." He leaned forward, his massive frame casting shadows that seemed to reach through the screen itself. "You see, we are Kryllian. We don't require threats to justify what we do. We simply do it." The transmission cut off, leaving Captain Chen staring at a blank screen that might as well have been her death warrant. "Battle stations," Thrax commanded. Though the term battle was something of a misnomer when applied to what was about to occur, it would be more accurate to call it recreational slaughter, or perhaps pre-dinner entertainment. A Kryllian fleet, consisting of 12 heavy cruisers and twice as many fighter craft, moved toward the lone human vessel with the inexorable certainty of a cosmic joke reaching its punchline. The safe harbor, meanwhile, sat helplessly in space like a minnow that had just realized it was swimming in a tank full of starving piranhas. Sir Vaxt reported with barely contained glee. Their ship appears to be, well, held together with what our scanners are reading as duct tape and some form of adhesive paste. Magnificent, Thrak replied, his mandibles spreading in what passed for a smile among his species. Begin the attack, and remember, I want some survivors. Fresh meat always tastes better when it's had time to properly marinate in terror. The first plasma bolt streaked across the void, and the 10-minute war began. The safe harbor shuddered like a dying animal as Kryllian plasma fire tore through her hull, systematically disabling engines, communications and life support with the precision of a surgeon removing organs. Thrak's forces weren't interested in quick kills. They preferred their prey conscious and aware of what was happening. It added what they called flavor to the experience. Hull breaches on decks 3 through 7, reported Weapons Master Krex, his voice carrying the same enthusiasm most beings reserved for discussing birthday parties. Life support is failing. They'll be suffocating soon. No, Thrak clicked disapprovingly, like a teacher correcting a particularly dense student. Where's the sport in that? Board them. I want to see the fear in their eyes before they die. The Kryllian boarding pod struck the safe harbor's hull with the subtlety of sledgehammers hitting a wine glass. Within moments, the refugee ship's corridors echoed with sounds that would give therapists nightmares for decades. The distinctive whine of energy weapons, the screaming of the innocent, and the wet, crunching noises that generally accompany the kind of violence that gets entire species classified as war criminals. Squad leader Gorthak kicked open the door to what the humans quaintly called their passenger compartment, a space that looked like someone had tried to cram a small city's worth of hope into a closet. Families huddled together, parents shielding children, elderly couples holding hands with the kind of quiet dignity that comes from having lived long enough to know when the story ends badly. Well, Gorthak rumbled, his voice synthesizer translating his amusement into something resembling galactic common. Look what we have here, a buffet. His squad spread out with the practiced efficiency of predators who had done this dance many times before. Energy rifles powered up with that distinctive whine that usually preceded someone having a very bad day. Children cried. Parents whispered final words of love. The elderly closed their eyes and waited for whatever came next. In the corner, largely unnoticed by the advancing death squad, sat a man named Marcus Webb. He was unremarkable in the way that most humans appeared unremarkable to alien eyes, average height, brown hair starting to show gray at the temples, wearing the kind of simple clothes that suggested someone who worked with his hands for a living. Next to him sat a little girl with pigtails and a stuffed rabbit that had seen better decades. "Daddy," whispered 8-year-old Emma Webb, her voice barely audible above the chaos, "are the monster men going to hurt us?" Marcus pulled his daughter closer, his jaw tightening in a way that suggested he was doing some very complicated mental mathematics. "No, sweetheart," he said quietly, his voice steady despite the circumstances. "Daddy won't let that happen." Gorthak, meanwhile, was enjoying himself immensely. He pointed his rifle at an elderly Centaurian couple and fired, turning them into something that would require a mop and bucket to clean up. The shot echoed through the compartment like thunder, and the screaming intensified. "Please," Captain Chen's voice crackled over the internal comm system, desperation bleeding through every word. "They're just refugees. They're not soldiers. They're families." Thrak's laughter boomed through the ship's speakers, the kind of sound that would make devils consider anger management classes. "Oh, my dear Captain, that's precisely what makes this so amusing. Soldiers fight back. Families just break." Gorthak was working his way through the compartment with the methodical precision of someone following a recipe, when his compound eyes fell upon the small human child clutching her stuffed rabbit. Something about her complete terror seemed to tickle his particular brand of sadism. "You," he said, pointing at Emma with one clawed appendage. "Come here, little meat thing." Marcus's grip on his daughter tightened, and for just a moment something flickered behind his eyes, something cold and calculating that had absolutely nothing to do with fear. "Stay behind me, Emma." "Oh, how precious," Gorthak chittered to his squad mates. "The male thinks he can protect the larva." He raised his rifle, not at Marcus, but at Emma. "Let's see how long that delusion lasts." The energy bolt took the 8-year-old girl's center mass, and she crumpled to the deck with the absolute finality that only death can provide. The stuffed rabbit fell beside her, its button eyes staring at nothing. The compartment fell silent except for the quiet sobbing of those still alive. Marcus Webb sat motionless, staring at his daughter's body with an expression that somehow managed to be completely blank and absolutely terrifying at the same time. Thrax's voice echoed through the ship again, dripping with mock sympathy. "Oh dear, did we break something valuable? My sincerest apologies, but don't worry, the rest of you won't have to mourn for long." That was when Marcus Webb looked up at Gorthak, and the Kryllian warrior felt something he hadn't experienced in decades of conquest and slaughter: genuine unease. The human's eyes had gone completely flat, like looking into the business end of an airlock. 10 minutes, Marcus said quietly, his voice carrying across the suddenly silent compartment. Gorthak blinked his compound eyes in confusion. "What did you say, meatsack?" Marcus Webb stood up slowly, gently placing Emma's stuffed rabbit in her lifeless hands. When he straightened, he looked directly at the squad leader, with the kind of expression that suggested he was making very detailed plans. "I said 10 minutes. That's how long you have left to live." The laughter that erupted from the Kryllian death squad was the kind that would make mental health professionals prescribe stronger medication. The idea that this soft, pathetic human could pose any threat to seasoned warriors was so absurd it bordered on comedy. Unfortunately for them, Marcus Webb wasn't the least bit interested in comedy. He had other things on his mind. Very specific, very violent things. What Gorthak and his merry band of genocidal tourists didn't know, and what the Kryllian intelligence network had somehow failed to mention in their briefings, was that Marcus Webb had spent the better part of 20 years teaching various hostile alien species the finer points of human military doctrine, not as a classroom instructor, mind you, but through the far more effective method of practical demonstration, usually involving high explosives and the kind of close-quarters combat that left lasting impressions on whoever was unlucky enough to survive. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Webb, retired, had been part of something called the Human Expeditionary Force, a military unit with the cheerful motto, "Violence is the universal language." During his service, he had earned decorations from 7 different planetary governments, 3 of which had been actively trying to kill him at the time. He specialized in what military euphemists called problem-solving, and what more honest observers called making very bad people very dead, very quickly. The fact that he was now traveling on a refugee transport with his daughter was not, as one might assume, due to any shortage of career opportunities. Rather, it was because Emma's mother had died in a mining accident, and Marcus had promised her he would raise their daughter somewhere safe, somewhere far from the kinds of places where people like him did the kinds of things he was exceptionally good at. So much for retirement plans. Marcus looked around the passenger compartment with the practiced eye of someone who had been in more hopeless situations than most people had hot dinners. The Kryllian death squad was busy terrorizing the remaining survivors, confident in their complete dominance of the situation. This confidence, while understandable, was about to prove rather expensive. Moving with the kind of casual nonchalance that comes from having nerves made of titanium steel, Marcus began what appeared to be grieving over his daughter's body. What he was actually doing was conducting a tactical assessment of available resources, enemy positions, and structural vulnerabilities. Old habits, after all, die hard. The passenger compartment had been designed with the kind of optimistic safety standards that assumed emergencies would be polite enough to wait their turn. This meant emergency supply lockers, maintenance access panels, and Marcus smiled grimly, a fire suppression system that used concentrated nitrogen, which could be very useful for creating distractions or suffocating enemies. He wasn't particularly picky at this point. "Lana," Marcus said conversationally, still kneeling beside Emma's body but now speaking loud enough for Gorthak to hear, "I always wondered what would happen if someone attacked a human child." Gorthak, who was in the process of deciding which refugee to execute next, paused and looked down at the grieving father with the kind of mild curiosity one might show toward an insect that had learned to speak. "Oh, and what happens, meat sack?" Marcus's hand moved to Emma's backpack, where she kept her school supplies, her favorite snacks, and because her father was a careful man who believed in being prepared, a small emergency kit that contained several items not typically found in children's luggage. Well, according to the official military manual, attacking human civilians, especially children, activates something called the Protection Protocol. Protection Protocol, Gorthak repeated, his mandibles clicking with amusement. How adorable! And what does this protocol involve? "Oh, it's quite simple, really," Marcus replied, his fingers closing around a small cylindrical object that looked suspiciously like a standard emergency flare, but wasn't. "It states that any being who deliberately harms a human child forfeits their right to continued existence. The implementation is left to the discretion of the nearest available human military asset." Gorthak's laughter was cut short by a sudden hissing sound, followed by the distinct smell of something that definitely wasn't air freshener. The emergency flare, which was actually a military-grade smoke grenade that Marcus had acquired during his service and never quite gotten around to returning, detonated with the enthusiasm of a small volcano, filling the compartment with thick, choking clouds that turned visibility into a purely theoretical concept. "What the?" Gorthak began, but his complaint was interrupted by the sudden and extremely violent introduction of a maintenance wrench to his skull, delivered with the kind of precision that comes from years of practice and a deep personal motivation to excel. The sound Gorthak's head made upon impact was remarkably similar to the noise one might hear when dropping a watermelon onto concrete from a considerable height. He collapsed to the deck with all the grace of a falling tree, and his weapon clattered away into the smoke. 9 minutes 30 seconds, Marcus announced to the chaos, his voice carrying the same calm professionalism one might use when reading the weather forecast. The remaining Kryllian squad members were now experiencing what military theorists call rapid tactical reassessment, which is a polite way of saying they were panicking like tourists who had just realized they were swimming with sharks. Energy rifle beams lanced through the smoke randomly, striking bulkheads, ceiling panels, and occasionally each other. Marcus, meanwhile, was moving through the artificial fog like a particularly motivated ghost. His 20 years of military experience had taught him many useful skills, but perhaps the most valuable was the ability to remain absolutely calm while everything around him descended into chaos. It was, he had often reflected, rather like being a librarian in a tornado, difficult to master but extremely useful once you got the hang of it. The second Kryllian to leave the mortal plane did so courtesy of his own energy rifle, which Marcus had liberated from Gorthak's still-twitching corpse. The weapon discharged directly into the alien's thorax, creating the kind of light show that would have been quite pretty if it hadn't been accompanied by screaming and the distinctive aroma of cooked insectoid. "Contact, contact!" The surviving squad members were shouting into their communicators, their voices carrying the kind of hysteria usually reserved for people who had just realized they were the punchline to a particularly violent joke. "We have a hostile. Repeat, we have a hostile." On the bridge of the Bone Crusher, Sub-Commander Vask was receiving these reports with the kind of confusion typically associated with beings who had just been told that mathematics was actually optional. "Sir, Squad 7 reports they are under attack." Thrak's mandibles clicked irritably. "Under attack? By whom? The ship is disabled, the crew is dead, and we're dealing with helpless refugees." "According to their transmissions, sir, it appears to be one human male." The bridge fell silent except for the gentle humming of life support systems and the distant sound of Thrak's brain attempting to process information that didn't quite fit his worldview. One human. A single soft, pathetic human is attacking a full Kryllian death squad. "That appears to be the situation, sir." Thrak's laughter boomed across the bridge, the kind of sound that suggested he found the entire situation deliriously entertaining. "Oh, this is rich. The little prey animal thinks it can fight back. Send another squad. I want to watch this amateur theater performance." Back on the safe harbor, Marcus was discovering that Kryllian energy rifles, while designed for beings with considerably more appendages, could be modified to human specifications with the application of some basic field engineering and a complete disregard for manufacturer warranties. The third alien learned this lesson the hard way when his own weapon, now in Marcus's possession, introduced him to the concept of irony in its most literal form. 8 minutes, Marcus announced, and somewhere in the smoke-filled compartment, the last surviving member of Squad 7 began to seriously reconsider his career choices. The final member of Squad 7, a particularly unfortunate Kryllian named Scritch, was discovering that panic and energy weapons make for a combination roughly as effective as attempting surgery with a sledgehammer. His wild firing had succeeded in damaging several bulkheads, melting a perfectly innocent chair, and creating what emergency response personnel would classify as additional problems. Marcus, meanwhile, had been busy conducting what he liked to think of as aggressive inventory management of Kryllian equipment. In addition to liberating several energy rifles, he had acquired what appeared to be some form of portable explosive device, a communications unit that was chattering with increasingly frantic reports, and a piece of alien armor that, while designed for a different species entirely, would provide at least some protection against return fire. 7 minutes, 20 seconds, he announced, just before Scritch learned that humans, despite their reputation for being soft and squishy, were apparently capable of moving through smoke-filled environments with the efficiency of particularly motivated phantoms. The last thing Scritch saw was a pair of disturbingly calm human eyes emerging from the artificial fog, followed by the business end of his own squadmate's weapon. The irony was not lost on him, though admittedly, he didn't have very long to appreciate it. Meanwhile, on the bridge of the Bone Crusher, the situation reports coming in were beginning to paint a picture that didn't quite match Thrax's expectations of how massacres were supposed to proceed. "Sir," Vax reported, his voice carrying the kind of confusion usually reserved for beings who had just discovered that gravity was actually optional, "Squad 7 has gone silent. Squad 12 reports they are approaching the human vessel to investigate." "Excellent," Thrax rumbled, settling back in his command throne with the satisfaction of someone who was about to enjoy dinner and a show. "Patch their helmet cameras through to the main screen. I want to watch these soft little mammals try to resist proper predators." What appeared on screen was 12 of the Kryllian Empire's finest warriors moving through the corridors of the refugee ship with the confidence of beings who had never encountered anything they couldn't handle through the application of overwhelming force. Their helmet-mounted cameras provided a perfect view of their systematic advance toward the passenger compartment, where Squad 7 had last been heard from. "Bioscans indicate multiple Kryllian life signs have ceased functioning in the target area," reported Squad Leader Vorthak, a veteran of 15 planetary conquests who considered genocide something of a hobby. Proceeding with enhanced caution protocols. Thrax's mandibles clicked with amusement. "Enhanced caution? Against humans? Oh, Vorthak, you always were overly dramatic." What happened next would later be studied in military academies across the galaxy as a textbook example of how superior firepower means absolutely nothing when deployed by overconfident idiots against someone who actually knows what they're doing. Squad 12 entered the passenger compartment to find it empty except for the bodies of their colleagues and a small pile of what appeared to be children's toys arranged in the center of the room. As they moved closer to investigate, the toys began to emit a high-pitched whining sound that experienced soldiers would have immediately recognized as the noise things make right before they explode. Marcus had spent the better part of 3 minutes converting Emma's electronic toys into improvised explosive devices using components from the Kryllian energy weapons, some creative rewiring, and the kind of technical expertise that comes from having blown things up professionally for 2 decades. The resulting explosion wasn't particularly large by military standards, but in the confined space of the passenger compartment, it proved remarkably effective at redistributing Kryllian body parts across a much wider area than nature had originally intended. 6 minutes, Marcus's voice echoed through the ship's communication system, somehow having gained access to the internal networks with the kind of technical skill that suggested his military training had been rather more comprehensive than simple point-and-shoot instruction. On the Bone Crusher's bridge, the main screen now showed nothing but static and the occasional floating piece of what had recently been Squad 12. The bridge crew was beginning to exhibit the kind of nervous energy typically associated with prey animals who had just realized they might not be at the top of the food chain after all. "Sir," Vask ventured, his voice carrying the careful tone one uses when delivering news that might result in immediate and violent death, "perhaps we should consider the possibility that these humans are not quite as helpless as our intelligence reports suggested." Thrax's response was to laugh even louder, though those with particularly keen hearing might have detected just the faintest note of uncertainty beneath the bravado. "Helpless? Of course they're helpless. This is just desperation. Send Squads 3, 4, and 5, and tell them to stop playing with their food and finish this quickly." What Thrax didn't know and what Marcus had been counting on was that Kryllian boarding protocols were designed around the assumption that their enemies would either surrender immediately or die trying to fight conventionally. They were not prepared for someone who treated their own ship as a 3-dimensional battlefield and had spent years learning how to kill things in environments where every surface could be used as a weapon. Marcus had managed to reach the ship's maintenance sections, where he discovered that refugee transports, despite their peaceful purpose, contained a surprising variety of equipment that could be repurposed for activities not covered in the manufacturer's warranty. Industrial cutting tools, high-pressure conduits, emergency systems designed to seal hull breaches. All of these could be turned into instruments of destruction by someone with the proper motivation and a comprehensive understanding of applied violence. Squad 3 learned this lesson when they attempted to breach the maintenance deck, only to discover that the corridor they were advancing through had been turned into what military engineers call a kill zone, and what everyone else calls a very bad place to be. Marcus had rigged the overhead conduits to release superheated coolant when triggered, creating an effect roughly equivalent to being attacked by an extremely angry geyser. The screaming that echoed through the ship's communication systems was the kind that would give therapy dogs nightmares. On the bridge, several crew members were beginning to look distinctly uncomfortable, shifting in their seats with the nervous energy of beings who were starting to suspect they might have seriously misjudged the situation. 5 minutes, Marcus announced over the comm system, his voice maintaining the same calm professionalism one might use when announcing boarding calls at a spaceport. Squad 4 had the misfortune to encounter Marcus in person, in a section of the ship where he had managed to rig the artificial gravity generators to create localized fields of crushing force. The result was a demonstration of what happens when beings accustomed to standard gravity suddenly find themselves experiencing forces roughly equivalent to being stepped on by a planet. Squad 5, showing considerably more wisdom than their predecessors, decided to adopt what they termed strategic repositioning, which everyone else recognized as running away very quickly. Unfortunately for them, Marcus had anticipated this reaction and had spent some time modifying the ship's automated systems to provide what he liked to think of as enhanced crowd control. The blast doors that slammed shut throughout the ship weren't designed to be weapons, but Marcus had discovered that when controlled remotely and timed properly, they could be remarkably effective at demonstrating the fundamental principles of physics to anyone unlucky enough to be caught between them. 4 minutes, came the announcement, and by now even Thrak was beginning to suspect that something had gone seriously wrong with what should have been a simple extermination operation. "Sir," Vask said carefully, "perhaps it's time to consider alternative strategies." But Marcus Webb wasn't finished yet. He had something special planned for the Warlord himself, something that would demonstrate once and for all why attacking human children was considered a spectacularly poor decision by anyone with functioning survival instincts. Thrak's compound eyes were beginning to show the kind of nervous twitching that typically indicated a predator's first uncomfortable realization that it might, in fact, be prey. The bridge of the Bone Crusher, which moments before had been filled with the confident chatter of beings who considered themselves the apex of galactic evolution, had fallen into the kind of silence usually reserved for funeral parlors and tax audits. "Sir," Vask ventured, his voice carrying the careful tone of someone who was beginning to seriously reconsider his career choices, "we've lost contact with all boarding parties. Perhaps we should withdraw and—" "Withdraw." Thrak's roar would have made atmospheric processors file noise complaints. From a single human, on a disabled refugee ship. He rose from his command throne, his massive frame casting shadows that seemed to reach across the bridge like grasping claws. "I am Thrak the Destroyer, conqueror of the Vexari homeworld, the being who turned the Zentorian fleet into cosmic dust. I will not be intimidated by some soft-skinned mammal playing with scrap metal." What Thrak didn't know, and what was about to become painfully apparent, was that Marcus Webb had spent the last 90 seconds doing something that would have impressed demolitions experts and horrified safety inspectors in equal measure. Using components salvaged from Kryllian weapons, the ship's power systems and what appeared to be a coffee maker from the crew quarters, he had constructed what military engineers would classify as an improvised transportation device and what everyone else would call a really dangerous way to travel between ships. The explosion that rocked the safe harbor wasn't large enough to destroy the ship, but it was precisely calibrated to create a breach in the hull that would allow a small object, say a human being wearing improvised armor, and carrying enough firepower to level a city block to be launched across the void between the two vessels with the efficiency of a particularly motivated missile. Marcus's arrival on the Bone Crusher was announced by the sudden and extremely violent introduction of his armored form through the bridge's main viewport, accompanied by a shower of transparent aluminum that sparkled prettily in the ship's artificial lighting before embedding itself in various crew members with the enthusiasm of particularly aggressive confetti. 3 minutes. Marcus announced as he landed on the bridge deck with the kind of impact that would have liquefied a normal human being, but merely annoyed someone who had spent 20 years learning how to survive things that should have killed him. The bridge crew's reaction was roughly equivalent to what one might expect from a group of house cats who had just discovered they were sharing their living space with a particularly motivated tiger. Energy weapons appeared with the kind of speed that suggested extensive practice, but Marcus had anticipated this response and had spent some time during his impromptu spaceflight preparing what he liked to think of as welcoming gifts. The grenades he tossed weren't standard military issue, those would have been far too simple. Instead, he had constructed improvised devices using Kryllian power cells, human ingenuity, and the kind of creative thinking that comes from having one's child murdered by aliens with superiority complexes. The resulting explosions created localized electromagnetic pulses that turned the bridge's sophisticated weapon systems into expensive paperweights. "Impossible," Thrak bellowed, drawing his personal sidearm, a weapon that could punch holes through starship hulls and had ended the lives of more beings than most plagues. "You're just a human," a soft, weak, pathetic excuse for a sentient species. Marcus looked up at the towering alien warlord, with the kind of expression one might wear when examining a particularly unimpressive insect. "You know what your problem is, Thrak?" He began advancing across the bridge, stepping over the bodies of crew members who had discovered that humans, despite appearances, were apparently immune to the effects of explosive decompression. "You never bothered to ask the right questions." "Questions?" Thrak's mandibles clicked with nervous energy as he backed toward his command throne, his weapon trained on the advancing human. "What questions?" "Well, for starters," Marcus continued, his voice carrying the same conversational tone one might use when discussing the weather, "you might have wondered why a species as soft and weak as humans managed to develop interstellar travel, establish colonies on dozens of worlds, and maintain diplomatic relations with civilizations that have been spacefaring for millennia longer than we have." Thrak fired his weapon, and the energy bolt that should have vaporized Marcus instead struck a piece of Kryllian armor that had been strategically positioned to deflect the shot directly back at its source. The irony was not lost on anyone present, though admittedly, most of them were too busy dying to appreciate it. "You might have asked," Marcus continued, advancing past Thrak's smoking corpse toward the command throne, "why human children carry emergency kits that contain military-grade equipment, or why human refugee ships are staffed by crews with extensive combat training, or why human colonies in dangerous sectors always seem to have remarkably effective defense capabilities." He settled into Thrak's command throne with the casual confidence of someone who had just claimed a prize he had earned through superior strategy and overwhelming force. The remaining bridge crew, those who were still capable of conscious thought, stared at him with the kind of expression typically reserved for beings who had just witnessed the fundamental laws of the universe being rewritten in real time. "The answer to all those questions," Marcus said, activating the ship's communication systems with the ease of someone who had spent considerable time studying alien technology, "is quite simple. Humans aren't the peaceful, helpless prey species you assumed we were. We're the galaxy's apex predators, and we've been very, very patient about letting everyone else think otherwise." He paused to examine Thrak's severed head, which he had removed with the kind of surgical precision that suggested extensive practice in battlefield medicine. 2 minutes, he announced, before standing and walking to the ceremonial weapons display that decorated the bridge. With movements that spoke of ritual and purpose, Marcus hung Thrak's head from the display rack, positioning it so that it would be the first thing anyone entering the bridge would see. The symbolism was unmistakable, and the surviving crew members began to exhibit the kind of involuntary bodily functions that typically accompany the complete collapse of one's worldview. "Attention, Kryllian Fleet," Marcus spoke into the communication system, his voice now being broadcast to every ship in the Armada. "This is Marcus Webb, formerly Lieutenant Colonel, Human Expeditionary Force. Your warlord attacked my daughter. This was a mistake. As you can see from the tactical displays on your screens, I have taken control of your flagship. Your boarding parties are dead. Your chain of command has been terminated." The silence that followed was the kind that typically precedes either surrender or complete psychological breakdown. Across the fleet, Kryllian warriors who had never known defeat were experiencing the novel sensation of genuine primal terror. "You have 30 seconds to begin withdrawing from human space," Marcus continued, his voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that comes from having nothing left to lose and everything necessary to make good on any threats. "Any ship that remains after that time will be destroyed. Any Kryllian forces found in human territory will be eliminated. Consider this your education in why attacking human children is considered inadvisable by anyone with functional survival instincts." 1 minute, he announced, and across the Kryllian fleet, engines began powering up with the kind of desperate urgency typically associated with natural disasters and tax deadlines. The news of what galactic historians would later term the 10-minute war spread across the galaxy with the kind of speed typically reserved for gossip about celebrity scandals and notifications about free food. Within 72 hours, every major civilization from the Centaurian Republic to the Vexari Trade Consortium had received detailed reports about how a single human had systematically dismantled the Kryllian Empire's most feared fleet using nothing but improvised weapons, superior tactics, and what appeared to be a deeply personal grudge. The initial reaction among most galactic governments was skepticism mixed with the kind of nervous laughter that typically accompanies stories that are too ridiculous to be true, but too detailed to be complete fabrications. After all, humans had been part of the galactic community for barely 50 years, and their reputation was that of pleasant, if somewhat primitive beings, who excelled at agriculture, entertainment, and making friends with species that everyone else considered too dangerous to approach. The Zentorian High Council was the first to officially request verification of the reports, dispatching their fastest scout ship to investigate the aftermath. What they found in the debris field where the Kryllian Fourth Devastation Fleet had once proudly terrorized the galaxy was enough to cause 3 council members to suffer what their physicians diplomatically termed stress-related digestive incidents. Floating among the wreckage of what had been 12 heavy cruisers and 24 fighters was the Bone Crusher, now broadcasting a continuous loop of Marcus Webb's final message. The ship itself had been converted into what military analysts would classify as a very pointed statement about the consequences of poor decision-making, with Thrax's head still hanging prominently in the command chamber as a decoration that would have made interior designers weep. The surviving Kryllian forces, meanwhile, had retreated to the furthest edges of their empire, where they were busy revising their military doctrine to include an entirely new classification of enemy: do not engage under any circumstances. Their intelligence reports, once filled with confident assessments of various species' military capabilities, now contained a single entry for humans that read simply, "Recommend immediate withdrawal if encountered. Refer to Incident Report 7734-X, the Webb Protocol." Other galactic civilizations were conducting their own urgent reassessments of human capabilities. The Vexari Trade Consortium quietly cancelled several pending territorial disputes with human colonies, suddenly discovering that their previous grievances had been based on computational errors and misunderstandings. The Hegemony of Worlds issued a diplomatic statement expressing their continued friendship and mutual respect for humanity, despite having never actually met any humans before. Perhaps most telling was the reaction of the Ethereal Collective, a species so advanced that they typically communicated only through interpretive mathematics and considered most other civilizations to be roughly equivalent to particularly clever houseplants. Their official statement, translated into standard galactic common, read, "We withdraw our previous assessment of human intellectual capacity. We also note that their children are very lovely and should be protected at all costs." The story of Marcus Webb spread through trading posts, diplomatic channels, and the kind of informal networks that exist wherever beings gather to share drinks and increasingly embellished tales. With each retelling, the details became more elaborate, the weapons more sophisticated, and the body count more impressive. By the time the story reached the Outer Rim territories, Marcus had apparently destroyed the entire Kryllian fleet, using nothing but a fork and his daughter's stuffed rabbit. What remained consistent across all versions, however, was the central message. Attacking human children was a mistake that carried consequences so severe that they redefined the very concept of proportional response. Military academies began incorporating the Webb doctrine into their curriculum, though most instructors prefaced their lectures with warnings about the psychological impact of the case study. The long-term effects of the 10-minute war were felt across human space, where colonies that had previously required extensive defensive installations suddenly found themselves remarkably free from hostile attention. Pirate activity in human sectors dropped to statistical insignificance, not because humans had become more aggressive, but because potential raiders had developed a sudden and intense interest in easier targets. Marcus Webb himself had vanished after his broadcast, taking the safe harbor and disappearing into the void with the kind of thoroughness that suggested he preferred his privacy. Rumors placed him everywhere from remote agricultural worlds to the heart of human military command, but the truth was far simpler. He had returned to the quiet life he had always wanted, secure in the knowledge that his daughter's sacrifice had purchased safety for human children across the galaxy. The galaxy had learned a valuable lesson about the nature of predators and prey, though it wasn't quite the lesson they had expected. Sometimes the most dangerous creatures are the ones that choose not to hunt, and the worst mistake you can make is giving them a reason to change their minds. After all, humans had spent centuries proving they could be peaceful. It had taken Marcus Webb only 10 minutes to demonstrate what happened when they chose not to be.